Mr. President, we have 12 officers at the gate demanding entry. They're armed and claiming authority to arrest you for treason. Ibrahim Traoré looked up from the children's letters he'd been reading, thank you notes from students whose schools had been built with money recovered from corruption investigations. Outside, armed vehicles surrounded the presidential palace while soldiers positioned themselves for what appeared to be a military coup. If watching betrayal turn into redemption through pure moral authority moves your soul, hit that subscribe button and let's witness leadership that transforms enemies into family. Any other leader would have called loyal forces, activated security protocols, or fled through emergency escape routes. Traoré did something unprecedented. He walked outside, alone and unarmed, straight toward the men who'd come to destroy him. "Gentlemen," he called to the shocked officers, "you look tired. When did you last eat? Come inside. My wife has prepared dinner for 20. We can discuss whatever concerns brought you here tonight." Captain Sawadogo, the coup leader, stood frozen. This wasn't in any military training manual. Presidents weren't supposed to invite their would-be executioners to dinner. They weren't supposed to ask about their welfare while staring down gun barrels. 4 hours later, these same officers would be sobbing as they confessed their shame and begged to serve the man they'd tried to betray. One simple question would break them completely. Which of your children will you tell that you helped destroy the future I'm building for them? Love conquers weapons, always. The betrayal had roots that went back 8 months when Captain Michel Sawadogo first received a phone call that would nearly destroy his soul. The voice on the encrypted phone was smooth, professional, speaking perfect French with a slight accent that suggested expensive European education. "Captain Sawadogo, my name is Philippe Dubois. I represent certain international interests concerned about Burkina Faso's current trajectory." Sawadogo had been carefully selected. Young, ambitious, respected by his peers, and quietly frustrated with some of Traoré's more radical policies. He had served loyally during the 2022 transition, but privately worried that Burkina Faso was isolating itself from important international partnerships. "Your president's policies are destroying your country's future," Dubois had explained during their first secret meeting in a Ouagadougou hotel. "Reasonable military leaders like yourself need to consider whether the nation's interests are being served by such extreme positions." The recruitment was gradual and sophisticated. Sawadogo was shown intelligence reports suggesting that Traoré's government was losing international support. He was given economic analyses claiming that independence policies would devastate Burkina Faso's economy. Most persuasively, he was told that senior officers across West Africa were growing concerned about military leaders who took their countries too far from international cooperation. Sawadogo hadn't acted alone. Dubois had identified 11 other officers with similar concerns, carefully building a network of military leaders who genuinely believed they were saving their country from disastrous leadership. Major Ouedraogo worried about losing French military training partnerships. Colonel Sankara feared that Russian military advisors were replacing Western expertise with inferior support. Lieutenant Colonel Compaoré believed that Traoré's confrontational approach to international relations would leave Burkina Faso vulnerable and isolated. Each officer had been approached with concerns tailored to their specific backgrounds and responsibilities. None of them realized they were being manipulated by foreign intelligence services that viewed Traoré's success as an existential threat to neo-colonial control systems across Africa. What made the betrayal particularly painful was that every conspirator had personal relationships with Traoré. Sawadogo had served as Traoré's aide during the 2022 transition. Ouedraogo had been personally promoted by Traoré based on merit rather than political connections. Sankara's family had benefited from Traoré's anti-corruption programs that had recovered stolen education funds. These weren't opportunistic soldiers seeking power or wealth. They were dedicated officers who had been convinced that their beloved president was endangering the country they had sworn to protect. Their betrayal came from love for Burkina Faso, manipulated by those who understood that good people could be turned against each other through carefully constructed fears. What None of the conspirators knew was the personal context of the night they chose for their coup attempt. February 8th was the anniversary of Traoré's father's death, a man who had taught his son that leadership meant serving others, even when it cost you everything. Traoré had spent the evening reading letters from children whose lives had been transformed by his government's policies. Schools built in villages that had never had education. Hospitals providing care to communities that had been forgotten by previous governments. Clean water systems bringing hope to families who had never imagined such possibilities. The children's letters were filled with dreams. I want to become a doctor like you helped my village get. I want to build roads so other villages can have schools too. I want to study agriculture so my family never goes hungry again. As the conspirators approached the palace, Traoré had been praying not for his own safety, but for wisdom to help the men who were coming to betray him. He understood something they didn't. Their coup attempt was a symptom of foreign manipulation rather than genuine military rebellion. He had known about the conspiracy for weeks. His intelligence services had tracked every meeting, every phone call, every promise made to turn his officers against him. But instead of arresting the conspirators, he had chosen a different path. Love your enemies, his grandmother had taught him. Not because they deserve it, but because hatred destroys the one who carries it. Tonight, he would test whether love really was stronger than betrayal, whether truth could overcome deception, and whether the bonds of shared humanity could heal the wounds of manipulation and fear. The 12 officers approaching his home were about to learn that some leaders respond to betrayal not with punishment, but with an invitation to remember why they had chosen to serve in the first place. As the armed convoy reached the presidential palace gates, Captain Sawadogo expected resistance, barricades, or at minimum a tense standoff with loyal security forces. Instead, he found something that completely disrupted his military planning. The gates were open, and Ibrahim Traoré stood alone in the courtyard, backlit by warm light from the palace windows. The sight was so unexpected that Sawadogo's carefully rehearsed commands died in his throat. His men looked to him for orders, but their captain found himself staring at a president who seemed genuinely happy to see them. As the armed convoy reached the presidential palace gates, Captain Sawadogo expected resistance, barricades, or at minimum a tense standoff with loyal security forces. Instead, he found something that completely disrupted his military planning. The gates were open and Ibrahim Traoré stood alone in the courtyard, backlit by warm light from the palace windows. The sight was so unexpected that Sawadogo's carefully rehearsed commands died in his throat. His men looked to him for orders, but their captain found himself staring at a president who seemed genuinely happy to see them. Sawadogo faced a decision that would define the rest of his life. His foreign handlers had prepared him for resistance, not for hospitality. Their carefully constructed narrative about Traoré's authoritarianism crumbled when confronted with a leader who treated potential executioners as invited guests. Men, Sawadogo announced after a long pause, secure your weapons and accompany me inside, but remain alert. As the officers reluctantly left their rifles in the vehicles, Traoré personally greeted each man by name, asking about their families and remembering personal details that showed he genuinely cared about their lives, beyond their military service. Lieutenant Colonel Traoré, Traoré said warmly, how is your daughter's recovery from surgery? I remember you needed emergency leave last month. Traoré's eyes widened. In the midst of planning a coup, the president was asking about his family's medical crisis with genuine concern and accurate memory of personal details. She's doing well, Mr. President. Thank you for remembering. And Major Ouedraogo, Traoré continued, congratulations on your son's acceptance to university. Mathematics, wasn't it? I'm proud that our educational reforms helped make that possible. Each personal interaction chipped away at the conspirators' ability to see Traoré as the threat their foreign handlers had described. This wasn't an authoritarian dictator, this was a leader who knew and cared about their families. Inside the presidential residence, the atmosphere was unlike anything the conspirators had imagined. The dining room was warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of traditional Birkenabe. cuisine and the sound of children's laughter from an adjacent room where Traoré's own kids were playing. Adjoa Traoré greeted each officer with maternal warmth, serving them personally and ensuring everyone had enough food. The sight of the president's wife treating them as honored guests rather than threats created cognitive dissonance that made their mission increasingly difficult to justify. "Officers," Traoré said as they shared the meal, "I know you didn't come here for dinner. You came because you love Burkina Faso and believe I'm endangering our nation's future. I respect that motivation, even if I disagree with your methods." The acknowledgement of their patriotic intentions, rather than accusations of treachery, disarmed the conspirators more effectively than any security force could have. "Captain Sawadogo," Traoré continued, "tell me honestly, what specific policies concern you most? Not what others have told you to think, but what you personally have observed that worries you about our country's direction." The question forced Sawadogo to articulate his concerns rather than rely on talking points provided by foreign handlers. As he spoke, Traoré listened with genuine attention, taking notes and asking clarifying questions that showed respect for legitimate concerns. "You're worried that our independence from French military cooperation will leave us vulnerable to security threats," Traoré summarized. "That's a reasonable concern. Let me show you something." He produced maps and statistics showing how Burkina Faso's security situation had actually improved since ending dependence on foreign military support. Terrorist incidents had decreased by 40%, military effectiveness had increased, and regional cooperation with neighboring African nations had strengthened significantly. "Major Ouedraogo," Traoré said, "you're concerned about losing access to Western military training. But look at these performance metrics from our own training programs. The data showed that locally designed military education programs adapted to regional conditions and cultural contexts were producing more effective officers than imported Western models that had never fully understood African military challenges. Our soldiers are performing better because they're trained to protect African communities, not to serve foreign strategic interests that may conflict with our people's needs." As the evening progressed, Traoré began sharing personal stories that connected policy decisions to human outcomes. He talked about visiting villages where his government's programs had brought clean water for the first time. He described meeting children whose lives had been saved by locally funded healthcare programs that weren't dependent on foreign aid with political conditions. "Colonel Sankara," Traoré said, "remember why you became a soldier? Was it to serve foreign interests or to protect Burkinabe families?" The question cut to the heart of military identity and purpose, forcing each officer to confront whether their actions served their oath to protect their people or served manipulative foreign interests that viewed African independence as threatening. As midnight approached, Traoré made a decision that would permanently transform the conspirators' understanding of their mission and their president. "Gentlemen," Traoré said quietly, "before you make your final decision about tonight, I want you to see something that will help you understand what you're really choosing between." He brought out hundreds of letters from children across Burkina Faso thank you notes for schools, hospitals, clean water systems, and opportunities that previous governments had never provided. "These children don't care about geopolitics or international partnerships," Traoré explained. "They care about having teachers, doctors, and hope for their futures. Every policy you want me to change represents dreams these children will never achieve if we return to foreign dependency." Traoré began reading specific letters aloud, each one more heartbreaking than the last. "Dear President Traoré, my name is Fatima. I am 8 years old. Before you built our school, I helped my mother fetch water for 6 hours every day. Now I can read and write. When I grow up, I want to build more schools like you did. Mr. President, I am Amadou. My baby sister was going to die, but your hospital saved her life. My father says you are a good man because you help people even when it's hard. President, my grandmother says before you came, our village never had anyone who cared about us. Now we have clean water and a clinic. Thank you for remembering that poor people matter too." As Traoré continued reading, several officers began crying openly. These weren't political abstractions, these were real children whose lives had been transformed by the very policies they had been convinced to oppose. Captain Sowadogo's voice broke as he asked, Mr. President, why didn't anyone tell us about these results? Why did our sources focus only on international criticism and economic concerns? Because, Traoré replied gently, the people manipulating you don't want you to see that African solutions to African problems work better than foreign dependency. They need you to believe that independence means isolation and failure. Traoré then revealed something that shattered the conspirators completely. He had recordings of their foreign handlers discussing how to manipulate African military officers into overthrowing governments that threatened Western economic interests. Michel, he said to Sowadogo, the man who recruited you, Philippe Dubois, isn't a concerned international analyst. He's a French intelligence operative whose job is destabilizing African governments that won't serve European corporate interests. The recordings were devastating. The conspirators heard their foreign contacts laughing about how easy it was to turn African soldiers against their own leaders by exploiting fears about isolation and economic problems. They called you all useful idiots, Traoré said sadly. Patriotic Africans who could be manipulated into destroying the independence their own ancestors died fighting for. The revelation that they had been manipulated by foreign operatives who viewed them with contempt broke the conspirators emotionally and spiritually. Major Ouedraogo collapsed into tears, realizing he had nearly betrayed everything his military oath represented. Mr. President, Sowadogo whispered through his tears, what have we done? We almost destroyed. We almost ... You almost made a terrible mistake, Traoré said gently, placing his hand on Sowadogo's shoulder. But you didn't. You came here with honest concerns, and now you have honest answers. The question is, what will you choose to do with the truth? One by one, the 12 officers who had come to arrest their president fell to their knees, begging forgiveness for their betrayal and asking how they could serve the vision of African independence they had nearly destroyed. Get up, Traoré said firmly but kindly. Leaders don't kneel. They stand up and serve their people. If you want to make amends, help me build the future these children are dreaming of. The coup attempt had become a religious experience of redemption, transformation, and renewed commitment to authentic African leadership. What happened in the final hours of that night would become legendary in military academies across Africa, as an example of how authentic leadership transforms enemies into the most loyal allies. As dawn approached, the 12 officers who had arrived as conspirators stood before Traoré ready to make a new commitment to the vision of African independence they had nearly betrayed. But the president had something even more powerful in mind than simple forgiveness. Gentlemen, Traoré announced, I want each of you to take a leadership role in the programs you were convinced to oppose. Captain Sowadogo, you'll oversee our new African military academy that trains officers to serve African interests rather than foreign agendas. The assignment was brilliant, turning the former coup leader into the architect of military education. That would prevent future manipulation of African soldiers by foreign intelligence services. Major Ouedraogo, you'll head our technology transfer initiative, working with our new partners to ensure we build domestic military capabilities rather than remaining dependent on foreign suppliers who use that dependence for political control. Each assignment was designed to channel the officers' patriotic energy into building the independence they had been manipulated into opposing. But Traoré's response to the betrayal went far beyond forgiveness and redemption. The coup attempt had revealed the full scope of foreign operations designed to destabilize African independence movements through manipulation of military leaders. Colonel Sankara, Traoré continued, you'll lead a new continental intelligence sharing initiative to help other African nations identify and counter foreign manipulation of their military officers. The assignment would turn the former conspirator into the coordinator of Africa-wide efforts to prevent the very type of manipulation he had experienced. We're going to share what happened here tonight with every African military academy. Every continental security organization and every leader who needs to understand how foreign intelligence services exploit our soldiers' patriotism against our people's interests. The recordings of foreign handlers discussing their manipulation of African military officers became the foundation for the most comprehensive exposure of neocolonial intelligence operations ever undertaken. Within days, the audio evidence was being broadcast across African media, showing listeners exactly how European intelligence services viewed African soldiers as useful idiots who could be manipulated into destroying their own country's independence. The impact was immediate and devastating to foreign influence operations. African military officers across the continent began reporting approaches by suspicious foreign contacts, creating a continent-wide intelligence network that effectively ended European ability to manipulate African soldiers against their own leaders. The story of the failed coup and the officers' redemption became international news, but not in the way foreign operatives had intended. Instead of reporting military instability in Burkina Faso, media outlets covered the sophisticated foreign manipulation of African soldiers and Traoré's extraordinary response that had transformed betrayal into loyal service. European governments found themselves defending intelligence operations that had been exposed through recordings, where their operatives expressed contempt for the very African soldiers they were recruiting. Most importantly, Traoré's handling of the coup attempt inspired other African leaders to examine their own militaries for signs of foreign manipulation. The Ouagadougou model of responding to betrayal with truth and redemption rather than punishment and vengeance spread across the continent. African military academies began incorporating specific training about foreign manipulation techniques, teaching officers how to identify and resist recruitment attempts by foreign intelligence services that sought to turn them against their own governments. The 12 former conspirators became the most effective advocates for African independence, precisely because they had experienced firsthand how foreign manipulation worked and how devastating its consequences could have been. Captain Sawadogo's speeches at military academies about his near betrayal became legendary. They convinced me I was saving my country by destroying it. They used my love for Burkina Faso to make me betray everything Burkina Faso represents. His testimony was more powerful than any theoretical discussion of foreign manipulation because it came from lived experience of how patriotic intentions could be weaponized against African interests. Perhaps most remarkably, Traoré invited all 12 former conspirators to become part of his extended family. Their children played with his children. Their wives became close friends with Ajoa. Holiday celebrations included the families of men who had once sought to destroy him. The transformation from betrayers to family members created unbreakable loyalty, based on genuine love rather than political calculation or military hierarchy. The failed coup attempt became Traoré's greatest strategic victory, not because he defeated enemies, but because he transformed them into the most committed servants of the vision they had been manipulated to oppose. Foreign intelligence services lost their most valuable assets, respected African military officers, who could be used to destabilize independence movements, while African governments gained intelligence about manipulation techniques and defense strategies. Traoré's response to betrayal established him as the most respected leader in Africa, not for his ability to punish enemies, but for his capacity to redeem them through truth and love. Other African leaders began adopting similar approaches to internal threats, recognizing that transformation was more powerful than punishment in building lasting stability and unity. The night of February 8, 2025, became known as the Night of Redemption in African military history, proof that authentic leadership could overcome any betrayal through moral authority. Backed by genuine care for people's welfare. Military academies across Africa studied the event as an example of how leaders should respond to challenges, with truth instead of propaganda, love instead of hatred, and redemption instead of revenge. The 12 officers who had arrived as enemies left as family, carrying a story that would inspire African soldiers for generations about the power of authentic leadership to transform even the most determined opposition into devoted service. the attempted coup that was meant to destroy. Ibrahim Traoré instead became the foundation for the most significant transformation in African military culture since independence, creating lessons that would reshape leadership and loyalty across the continent. Within 6 months of the failed coup, every African military academy had incorporated the Ouagadougou principles into their leadership training. Respond to betrayal with truth, transform enemies through understanding, and build loyalty through genuine care rather than fear or punishment. The 12 former conspirators became traveling instructors, sharing their experience of manipulation and redemption with military officers across Africa. Their testimony about foreign intelligence recruitment techniques prevented dozens of similar coup attempts in other countries. Military effectiveness improved dramatically as soldiers learned to identify and resist foreign manipulation while developing genuine loyalty to leaders who demonstrated authentic care for their welfare and their families' futures. The exposure of foreign manipulation techniques triggered the most comprehensive counterintelligence sharing program in African history. Military intelligence services across the continent began coordinating to track and neutralize foreign recruitment operations targeting African soldiers. European intelligence agencies found their African operations severely compromised as soldiers they had been cultivating for years revealed their contacts to new continental security networks designed to protect African military independence. The intelligence revolution extended beyond military affairs as civilian leaders learned to recognize similar manipulation techniques used to destabilize African political and economic independence. Traoré's response to betrayal inspired a new generation of African leaders who understood that authentic authority comes from serving people rather than controlling them. The redemption model of leadership spread beyond military affairs into civilian governance. Leaders across Africa began responding to opposition and criticism with dialogue and understanding rather than suppression, creating more stable governments based on genuine popular support rather than fear or foreign backing. Perhaps most remarkably, the concept of treating betrayers as family members who had been misled rather than enemies to be destroyed created a new model of African governance based on Ubuntu philosophy, the understanding that individual welfare is inseparable from collective welfare. Governments began addressing opposition by examining underlying concerns and foreign manipulation, rather than simply punishing dissent, creating more resilient political systems that could withstand external pressure. The story of the 12 officers became required study in African schools as an example of how foreign powers used local conflicts and concerns to serve external interests that damaged African development. Children learned to recognize manipulation techniques, while understanding that patriotism meant serving African interests rather than foreign agendas disguised as international cooperation. Universities across Africa developed courses on psychological warfare and African independence that taught students how to identify and resist foreign manipulation of local politics, economics, and military affairs. The peaceful transformation of a coup attempt into a redemption experience gained international attention as an example of leadership that transcended traditional concepts of power and authority. International relations programs began studying the Traoré response as an innovative approach to internal threats that achieved better security outcomes than traditional punishment-based methods. Most touching was the ongoing relationship between Traoré and the former conspirators, who became his most trusted advisors and closest friends. Their children grew up together, creating bonds that would ensure loyalty across generations. The transformation from betrayal to family relationship became a model for conflict resolution that spread beyond politics into community and family relationships across Africa. The redemption experience created a spiritual awakening among participants who recognized that love really was more powerful than hatred, truth more effective than propaganda, and service more lasting than domination. Religious leaders across Africa incorporated the story into teachings about forgiveness, redemption, and the transformative power of treating enemies with unexpected kindness and understanding. The shared experience of foreign manipulation brought African nations closer together as they recognized common threats and developed coordinated responses. To protect continental independence, the Night of Redemption became a symbol of African capacity for unity, forgiveness, and transformation that inspired broader continental cooperation in economics, politics, and security affairs. The young African president who had responded to betrayal with dinner invitations and family inclusion proved that authentic leadership creates loyalty through love rather than fear, transforms enemies through understanding rather than punishment, and builds lasting stability through redemption rather than revenge. His example demonstrated that the strongest leaders are those who can turn their greatest challenges into opportunities for growth, understanding, and deeper commitment to the values they serve. Smash that subscribe button and like this video for more stories about leaders who choose love over hatred, redemption over revenge, and transformation over destruction. Your support helps us share these powerful lessons about authentic leadership that heals rather than harms.